For more than 1,000 years, one of the most mysterious peoples in British history carried a reputation built almost entirely on legend rather than evidence. Medieval writers claimed they had sailed to Scotland from Thrace, near the Aegean Sea. Others insisted they came from Scythia, in Eastern Europe, or from unnamed islands somewhere north of Britain entirely. They left behind elaborate carved stone symbols nobody has ever fully deciphered, an origin story that spans half the ancient world and almost no written record of their own to explain any of it. In 2023, a team of geneticists finally extracted usable DNA directly from the actual bones of these people, comparing it against more than 8,000 other ancient and modern genomes from across Britain and Europe. What they found didn't just settle a centuries-old mystery. It quietly dismantled almost every dramatic origin story ever told about one of Scotland's most enigmatic ancient peoples, and revealed something considerably more interesting hiding underneath the legend. The people in question are the Picts, whose name comes from a Latin term used by Roman writers, generally translated as the Painted Ones, a reference to their reported practice of tattooing or painting their bodies. They first appear in the written historical record in the late 3rd century CE, described by Roman sources as a fierce, unconquered people, occupying the northern reaches of Britain, beyond the edge of Roman control. Over the following centuries, the Picts formed powerful kingdoms across eastern and northern Scotland, kingdoms substantial and organized enough to leave behind an extensive body of carved stone monuments decorated with intricate, still largely undeciphered symbols that continue to defy confident interpretation by modern archaeologists and linguists alike. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Gaelic language, culture, and political identity had become dominant across the region, gradually transforming the Pictish kingdoms into what became known as Alba, the direct historical precursor to the medieval Kingdom of Scotland. Despite ruling a substantial territory for roughly 6 centuries, the Picts left behind remarkably little written material of their own, a genuine scarcity of direct textual evidence that historians have long referred to as the Pictish problem, a term popularized by archaeologist Frederick Threlfall Wainwright in a 1955 edited volume specifically devoted to the subject. That scarcity of direct evidence created a genuine historical vacuum, one that later medieval writers and eventually early modern scholars filled with an unusually wide and often wildly speculative range of theories. At various points across history, the Picts and their still mysterious language have been seriously proposed by different scholars as Germanic, Gaelic, Brittonic, Basque, and even Illyrian in origin, with the most dramatic medieval legends tracing their ancestral homeland to Thrace or Scythia, framing the Picts as genuine foreign invaders who had sailed enormous distances to settle in the north of Britain. In the 1950s, the influential linguist Kenneth Jackson argued the Picts likely spoke a non-Indo-European language separate from Celtic entirely, a theory that further reinforced the sense that the Picts represented a genuinely foreign, mysterious population with roots entirely disconnected from their neighbors in Britain. Resolving this specific, long-running historical puzzle using archaeology and linguistics alone had proven genuinely difficult, precisely because the Picts left behind so little direct written material capable of settling the question conclusively. What finally cracked the problem open was a study published in April 2023 in the journal PLOS Genetics, led by researchers Adeline Morez of Liverpool, John Moores University, and Linus Girdland Flink of the University of Aberdeen. The research team successfully sequenced 2 high-quality ancient genomes recovered from Pictish burials at 2 separate sites, Ballintor in Easter Ross and London Links in Fife, both dated to between the 5th and 7th centuries CE. Rather than analyzing these 2 genomes in isolation, the researchers compared them directly against a dataset of more than 8,000 previously published ancient and modern genomes drawn from across Britain and the wider European continent. A comparison scale genuinely large enough to place the Picts precisely within the broader context of British population history for the first time. The results were direct, and they thoroughly dismantled the more exotic medieval origin theories that had circulated for well over 1,000 years. The genetic analysis revealed that the Picts descended directly from local Iron Age populations who had already been living across Britain long before any of the more dramatic proposed migrations from Thrace, Scythia, or anywhere else in continental Europe could plausibly have occurred. There was no genetic signature connecting the Picts to any exotic distant origin whatsoever. Instead, the researchers found genuine, measurable genetic similarity between the ancient Pictish genomes and present-day populations living specifically in western Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Northumbria. A considerably less dramatic finding than any of the old legends, but a genuinely significant one, because it directly confirmed what mainstream British archaeology had already suspected for decades, based on material culture alone, that the Picts were never foreign invaders at all. They were an indigenous population, descended from the same broader Iron Age British ancestral stock as their neighbors, who developed a genuinely distinctive culture, art style, and political identity in place, rather than importing it from somewhere else entirely. The same research also directly addressed and effectively overturned a second equally persistent historical myth surrounding the Picts, one concerning how they organized succession and inheritance within their own society. The influential 8th century English monk and historian Bede had claimed the Picts followed a system of matrilineal succession in which a ruler's authority and wealth passed down specifically through the female line to a sister's son rather than to a direct son through the male line, a genuinely unusual practice by the standards of most neighboring societies at the time. This claim had been repeated and taken seriously by historians for centuries afterward, feeding directly into a broader popular image of the Picts as a society organized around genuinely distinctive, unusual social customs. To test this specific claim directly, the research team sequenced complete mitochondrial DNA genomes, tracing maternal lineage specifically from 7 individuals interred together at the London Link Cemetery. If Bede's claim about matrilineal succession held any real demographic truth, researchers reasoned, one might expect individuals buried together in a socially significant cemetery to show some meaningful degree of shared maternal ancestry, reflecting descent traced specifically through the female line. Instead, the genetic analysis found the opposite. The 7 individuals sampled shared no common maternal ancestor at all, indicating that women in this specific Pictish community likely married in from outside their own immediate social group, a genetic pattern that runs directly counter to what a genuinely matrilineal system of inheritance would predict. As the study's authors noted directly in their own subsequent public writing on the research, published through The Conversation, scholars now generally believe Bede's specific claim about Pictish matrilineal succession was likely a fabrication, quite possibly constructed deliberately to help validate the specific claims of certain individual rulers, rather than representing an accurate description of genuine, widespread Pictish social practice. Beyond directly refuting these 2 specific, long-standing myths, the study revealed something genuinely more nuanced and interesting about Pictish genetic identity as a whole. Rather than finding a single uniform Pictish genetic signature shared cleanly across every sample the researchers examined, the broader genetic variation visible among ancient Pictish individuals pointed toward dynamic, genuinely complex communities rather than one static, homogeneous population sharing one single common ancestral profile. This finding lines up naturally with the broader picture population geneticists have established for the deep genetic history of the British Isles overall. generally modeled as a layered combination of three distinct deep ancestral components: an original Western European Mesolithic hunter-gatherer population, a later wave of early European farmers descended from Anatolian Neolithic populations who spread agriculture across Europe, and a still later contribution from late Neolithic and Bronze Age steppe-related populations. Be connected to the broader Yamnaya-descended migrations that reshaped much of Europe's genetic landscape roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. The Picts, according to this 2023 research, represent a genuinely local variation on this same broader, shared British ancestral foundation, not a separate exotic population layered on top of it from somewhere else entirely. This same 2023 academic study connects directly to a considerably larger, complementary body of research examining Scottish genetic history more broadly, most notably the landmark People of the British Isles project, which has systematically collected and analyzed genetic data from thousands of residents across Scotland and the wider United Kingdom, comparing modern populations directly against the deeper historical and archaeological record of the British Isles. That broader research effort identified 6 genuinely distinct genetic clusters, specifically within Scotland, corresponding remarkably closely to the historical boundaries of Scotland's major early medieval so-called Dark Age kingdoms: the Borders region, the southwest, corresponding to the historical kingdom of Strathclyde; the northeast, corresponding to historical Pictland itself, along with the Hebrides, Orkney, and Shetland, as further distinct genetic clusters in their own right. Modern residents of Scotland sampled within each of these 6 regional clusters showed genuine, measurable genetic similarity to their own region's specific ancient population, a striking demonstration of just how much long-term geographic stability and comparatively limited large-scale population movement has actually shaped Scotland's genetic landscape across well over 1,000 years of subsequent history. Among these 6 regional clusters, Orkney and Shetland stand out as a genuinely distinctive and well-documented special case, one connected directly to a specific, historically well-recorded later chapter of Scottish history, entirely separate from the earlier Pictish period. These 2 island groups show the highest concentration of Norwegian genetic ancestry found anywhere outside Scandinavia itself, a direct, measurable genetic legacy of sustained Viking-era Norse settlement across these specific islands, beginning around the 9th century CE and continuing for several centuries afterward. What makes this specific finding genuinely interesting, though, isn't simply the overall Norwegian ancestry component itself, but the particular way that ancestry is distributed once researchers separate paternal and maternal genetic lineages and examine each one individually. Y chromosome data tracing the direct paternal line shows Norse origin genetic markers clearly dominating the male population of Orkney and Shetland today. Mitochondrial DNA tracing maternal ancestry tells a genuinely different story, showing considerably more continuation of pre-Norse, Celtic, and Pictish-linked maternal ancestry than the paternal data alone would suggest. This specific pattern, dominant Norse paternal ancestry paired with predominantly pre-existing local maternal ancestry, points toward a fairly specific historical settlement dynamic: Norse men arriving and establishing themselves within existing local communities, frequently marrying local Pictish and Celtic women already living on these islands, rather than large numbers of complete Norwegian families migrating together and settling in genetic isolation from the pre-existing population. This is, notably, a genuinely similar sex-biased admixture pattern to what population geneticists have documented in several entirely separate historical contexts elsewhere in the world, including, as one clear example, the well-documented genetic legacy of Spanish colonial contact in Mexico, where a comparable pattern of predominantly male incoming migrants intermarrying with existing local women left a directly comparable genetic signature, dominant incoming paternal ancestry layered on top of considerably more continuous local maternal ancestry embedded in the DNA of descendant populations centuries later. At the level of broader Y chromosome haplogroup classification specifically, the genetic evidence indicates that Picts were, at the largest and most basic genetic scale, essentially indistinguishable from other Celtic-speaking populations living elsewhere in Britain during the same general historical period. Both Pictish individuals and broader British Celtic populations share the same dominant Y chromosome haplogroup, R1b-L21, a lineage strongly associated with Celtic-speaking populations across the British Isles more broadly. Rather than carrying any genuinely distinctive, separate paternal genetic signature that would clearly mark the Picts out as a fundamentally different population from their immediate neighbors. It remains a genuinely open, actively researched question whether specific, finer genetic subclades sitting beneath this broader R1b-L21 haplogroup might eventually reveal more specifically Pictish-associated lineages, since some researchers examining currently available Y DNA data have noted certain subclades showing geographic concentrations specifically within historically Pictish territory in eastern Scotland, stretching roughly from Fife to Caithness, that appear comparatively rarer in historically Gaelic or Norse-influenced regions of the country. Whether this specific geographic pattern genuinely reflects a distinctly Pictish paternal lineage, or simply reflects long-established local populations who happen to already be living within Pictish territory before any distinctly Pictish political or cultural identity fully formed around them, remains a genuinely open question current research has not yet definitively resolved, one that will likely require considerably more ancient DNA specifically recovered from confirmed Pictish period burials before it can be settled with real confidence. The broader linguistic question surrounding the Picts, one closely intertwined with these genetic findings, but not fully identical to them, has also moved toward a considerably clearer scholarly consensus in recent decades, even as some genuine uncertainty remains. Where mid-20th century scholarship following Kenneth Jackson's influential 1950s work had proposed that the Picts might have spoken a genuinely non-Indo-European language entirely separate from their Celtic-speaking neighbors, the current scholarly consensus holds instead that the Picts most likely spoke a Celtic language, specifically one most closely related to the Brittonic branch shared by their immediate southern neighbors. The ancestral language that would eventually develop into modern Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, rather than to Gaelic, the Celtic language that would later become politically and culturally dominant across Scotland following the merger of Pictish and Gaelic kingdoms into the unified kingdom of Alba. Some scholars continue to point to specific undeciphered inscriptions and certain isolated vocabulary items as potential evidence that at least some Picts may have retained elements of an older, separate, otherwise unattested pre-Celtic language, layered underneath the dominant Brittonic Celtic tongue, a genuinely open linguistic question that, notably, DNA evidence on its own cannot fully resolve. Since language and genetic ancestry, as population geneticists studying entirely different regions and time periods have repeatedly demonstrated, don't always travel together through history as a single, perfectly unified package. Put all of this research together, and the honest, evidence-based picture of Scottish ancestry that emerges is considerably more grounded, and in its own way considerably more genuinely remarkable than any of the old exotic origin legends ever managed to be. The Picts were never mysterious foreign invaders who sailed to Scotland from Thrace or the distant steppes of Eastern Europe. They were a genuinely indigenous population, descended directly from the same Iron Age British ancestral stock shared with their neighbors in Wales, Ireland, and northern England, who developed a distinctive culture, political identity, and enigmatic artistic tradition entirely in place, Over many centuries, without needing any dramatic migration story to explain their origins at all. Bede's specific claim about Pictish matrilineal succession, repeated as established historical fact for well over 1,000 years, appears instead to have been at least partly fabricated, contradicted directly by the genetic evidence recovered from an actual Pictish community's own burial ground. And the broader genetic landscape of modern Scotland, mapped in real detail through large-scale research projects extending well beyond the Picts specifically, reveals a population shaped considerably more by long-term regional stability and continuity, stretching directly back to the boundaries of early medieval kingdoms than by any of the sweeping, exotic origin narratives that popular history has often preferred to tell about it. Where Orkney and Shetland genuinely do carry a real, substantial, and historically well-documented later genetic contribution from Viking-era Norse settlement, even that specific chapter of Scottish genetic history reveals itself, once properly read at the level of paternal versus maternal ancestry, as a story of gradual settlement and intermarriage rather than the kind of wholesale, dramatic population replacement the more sensational, popular retellings sometimes imply. The real DNA-confirmed story of Scottish origins turns out to need no invented drama whatsoever to be genuinely compelling. It was never a story about who arrived from somewhere impossibly far away. It was, from the very beginning, a story about who was already there.